Now, with Bijan Robinson in the fold, the Falcons' formational flexibility is going to blow your minds.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and, of course, the very humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more with FanDuel by visiting FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And guys, we want to thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So later in today's episode, we will be joined by TJ McCreight, over of the 33rd team, to break down the Falcons draft and give his thoughts on why he thinks Bijan Robinson was the best player in this draft class. And later in the episode, we'll answer a question about the possibility of the Falcons trading back and still landing a player like Bijan Robinson in round one. But first, I want to start off by talking about what I think is going to be a buzzworthy topic over the coming months as we gear up for training camp and then ultimately the season, which is the ways that Bijan Robinson and the potential for him to transform the Falcons offense. And one of those ways is with a increased usage of 22 personnel. And we've talked before about what the various personnel groupings are and what those numbers mean. That first number refers to the number of running backs. The second number refers to the number of tight ends. So 22 personnel would be 2 running backs and 2 tight ends. 11 personnel would be 1 running back and 1 tight end. 12 personnel, 1 running back, 2 tight ends, etc. Now, if you look back to last season, the Falcons ran 11 personnel, those 3 wide receiver sets. They ranked 31st in the NFL in usage of 11 personnel, running at about 28% of the time. The NFL average was about 60% of the time last year. The Falcons ranked 13th in 12 personnel usage, about 27% of the time, while the NFL average was slightly below that, between like 20 and 25%. 21 personnel, the Falcons ranked 5th, running at 22% of the time, with the NFL average being about a third of that, around 7%. And then 22 personnel, the Falcons were second in the NFL with 11% behind the Baltimore Ravens, and the NFL average was about 3% of the time. So the Falcons dialed up that 22% personnel a lot higher than your NFL average team. Now, what was unique about the Falcons is that they were one of the rare teams in the NFL that utilized, 11, 12, 21 personnel groupings about equal amount of time, right? If you look at the Falcons, the 49ers, the Bears, and the Texans, they were the only teams in the NFL that utilized those 3 personnel groupings, 11, 12, and 21, on at least 19% of their plays each, right? They also happened to be 4 of the 5 teams that had the lowest percentage of 11 personnel usage, right? And so what Bijan Robinson can do to the Falcons is be able to integrate some of these personnel looking groupings into sort of one formation, right? Where the Falcons, because they can move Bijan and other players around the formation, they can present a look in one personnel grouping and then basically transform into another personnel grouping, although technically they're still the same personnel grouping because you're counting the running backs and tight ends the same, but they can present a different look, right? So I'm expecting to see a lot more 22 personnel for the Falcons, which they ran about 11% of the time. And that number may wind up doubling this year, where you're featuring 2 running backs, which are going to be Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier, 2 tight ends, which is going to be Kyle Pitts and Jonnu Smith, and 1 wide receiver. And the Falcons can line up Bijan Robinson in the backfield and then motion him out into the slot receiver role. And all of a sudden, the Falcons have just transformed into 12 personnel. Or they can split out Kyle Pitts out wide and function him as a wide receiver and move Bijan into the slot, and all of a sudden they look like they're 11 personnel. And Bijan, what he brings to the table is that unique pass catching ability that is comparable to Christian McCaffrey or Alvin Kamara as these sort of running backs that anytime we talk about, these great pass catchers, those are our go-tos. And Bijan has a similar type of potential. And we've already kind of seen the Falcons utilize Cordarrelle Patterson in the past right, in that capacity as a kind of a dual running back receiver threat. And I think we'll see a lot of the Falcons doing that with Bijan this year and in the future. And so what this does is typically in the NFL, defenses tend to be predictable in terms of how they try to match up with teams, right? If you're playing 11 personnel, you have 3 wide receivers on the field, defenses will generally play nickel with against you, featuring 3 3 cornerbacks or 5 defensive backs, because some teams play big nickel in order to, because it's the nickel is weaker against the run, they like to use a extra safety as that nickel back rather than a cornerback, so that they can be a little bit better against the run in that situation. But if an offense is deploying 12 or 21 or 22 personnel, typically defenses will play base defense against you. And we've talked about this before in the podcast, where like the difference between the McVay style West Coast offense and the Shanahan style West Coast offense have similar roots, but they sort of branched off, because what McVay did famously with the Rams when that offense was, operating at its highest powers back in the day, which was they would run like 11 personnel like over like 90% of the time. And so it would force defenses to play nickel, and then they would just run it down your throat with Todd Gurley, as well as being a very effective passing offense with McVay's play calling. And then Shanahan, on the other hand, goes the opposite direction, where he runs 21 personnel roughly like half the time, right? Where he has Kyle Juszczyk or fullback out there. You guys saw that here in Atlanta with Patrick DeMarco and his usage in the offense. And basically his decision, you're going to play base defense against us, and we're going to throw against your base defense to athletic fullback like a Kyle Juszczyk, like a George Kittle and Deebo Samuel, and all of those guys. It's essentially zigging when the defense expects you to zag, right? And the Falcons have that flexibility, have more of that flexibility and potential to do that now that they've added Bijan Robinson. They already had it with Cordarrelle Patterson, but because Cordarrelle Patterson's an older player and hasn't been able to stay healthy for a full season, the Falcons haven't necessarily been able to lean on that as like the main weapon in their offense, like they have the potential to do over several more years into the future with a young, and hopefully healthy Bijan Robinson. And that's kind of the beauty of having that 2-headed backfield with him and Algier, because you're not going to necessarily get Bijan to take on the wear and tear that a typical running back would take, because he gets the split carries with Tyler Algier, and that Tyler Algier can be that grinder, and Bijan can be more of that finesse type of player that we're talking about. And so, when the Falcons deploy this 22 personnel, defense is going to play base against it. But because, you're going to motion Bijan out into the slot, it's going to create a mismatch, because teams are going to be like, okay, well, we got to put a linebacker on him, right? And so, that's going to be a problem for, that linebacker covering Bijan Robinson, who is capable of running routes like a receiver. That's why we compare him to Christian McCaffrey and Alvin Kamara. And so, this flexibility that you get with Bijan Robinson, as well as other players, like Bijan can play running back and receiver, Jonnu Smith can play tight end and fullback, Kyle Pitts can play tight end and receiver, you got Parker Hesse, who can also do fullback and tight end stuff. This is why, like, I've been throwing slander at Keith Smith, because it's not to say that I had this vision for the offense back when, I was saying back in January, February, that I think the Falcons should move on for Keith Smith. But I do think, having a more versatile fullback that can do tight end stuff or be a more dynamic pass catcher than Keith Smith is going to be much more beneficial for this type of offense that we're talking about. But Keith Smith is fine for the time being. We'll see how the Falcons deploy him and Jonnu Smith and Parker Hesse and potentially Clint Rakovich as well. So that will be something to keep an eye on. But while I don't think this is going to be the Falcons' like main attack that they're going to see down in and down out, like they're not going to run it like 60% of the time. Again, you might only see it 20% of the time, but you may see a breakdown where it seems like the Falcons run each of these formations equally, right? Where it's like they run 11 personnel 20% of the time, 12 personnel 25% of the time, 13 personnel 15% of the time. That's the 3 tight end sets. 21 personnel 20% of the time, and 22 personnel like 20% of the time, or something like that, give or take a couple of percentage points. And so that's going to force teams, with those formations, 80% of the time, those are formations, right, outside of the 11 personnel, where teams are typically going to play base defense. And so if teams are playing base defense, you like the ability for the Falcons to have these athletic weapons that can be mismatches in those situations. And those are matchups that the Falcons can exploit through the air with Ritter, with London, with Pitts, with Bijan, etc. Or if teams basically are deciding, okay, we're going to continue to play nickel against you because we want to get, a big nickel or a safety or something matched up in this to prevent this passing attack, right? Then all of a sudden the Falcons are like, okay, you're going to play nickel and have a softer box. Well, we're going to run it down your throat. So it's sort of a pick your poison. That's what the Falcons are building towards. And so the potential of this style of offense is tremendous. And so we'll see how quickly the Falcons can integrate it into their offense this year. But it's going to be fun, right, to hear people around the NFL talking about the Falcons and the different schematic things that they're doing to keep defenses on their toes that we really just haven't seen a lot of people, these last couple of years as the Falcons have been sort of an also ran, where people aren't talking about the Falcons offense as this, innovative and iconic unit. And the last time, and again, I'm not saying it's going to be on this level, but the last time we had that was in 2016 when the Falcons went to the Super Bowl. And it would be nice to get back to a point where I can turn on a podcast from, an NFL podcast and like, hey, did you see the Falcons and what they did to the, I don't know, Seahawks or whoever on Sunday, that sort of thing. So that is something that I'm certainly excited about. I think you guys should certainly be excited about, but you should also be excited about our next guest, which is going to be TJ McCreight from the 33rd team to talk about Bijan Robinson's skill set, as well as the 2023 Falcons draft class, and give his thoughts on that. But before we get there, guys, it's time to make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs. And right now, new customers get a no sweat first bet up to $1,000. That means you get $1,000 back in bonus bets, even if your first bet doesn't win. In the NBA playoffs, it's a great time to check out FanDuel. And it's coming off of the heels of the NFL draft, where I put in some prop bets. You guys can put in some prop bets possibly for next year's draft, as well as this upcoming season. Now that we have a better idea of what the NFL rosters are going to be, you can also do a parlay. That means you bet a little, you potentially can win a lot. Especially great for Major League Baseball because you can build a parlay builder where you can, bet on Sean Murphy hitting a homer or Ronald Acuna driving in a run. There's no better place to bet it all than America's #1 sports book at FanDuel. So visit FanDuel.com/locked-on today and you get your no sweat first bet up to $1,000. Again, that's FanDuel.com/locked-on. FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, everyone, you are back with another illustrious guest here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. I am joined by TJ McCreight, formerly the player personnel executive with the Philadelphia Eagles. He's now with the 33rd team, and at the 33rdteam.com, they're providing you with unparalleled insight for fans, fantasy players, and bettors through an unmatched roster of NFL experienced contributors, including executives, head coaches, and players. Visit the33rdteam.com this week to find out how their unmatched roster of NFL decision makers graded your team's draft. So we're going to be talking about TJ's thoughts on the Falcons draft. TJ has a wealth of experience not only with the Eagles, but was a scout for the Ravens, the Browns, the Cardinals, the Colts. He served as a scout, director of player personnel, pro personnel, director of college scouting. You've done it all, TJ. And I know a couple of months ago, you wrote an article about Bijan Robinson and the potential that because the running back position has been devalued, is that worth a first round selection? Well, the Falcons, of course, took him very high in the first round with the 8th overall selection. So what are your thoughts now that we've seen Bijan be selected in the round 1 to the Atlanta Falcons?
Aaron, he was my #1 player. I thought he was the best player in this draft. What is unique about him? He has some Christian McCaffrey to his game, and the Falcons fans will see this. He is an outstanding route runner and has outstanding hands and ball skills. He could possibly even play wide receiver. So he just brings another dimension to this passing game for the Falcons that no other back in the draft could have done, and probably no back since McCaffrey could do. So this is a special player for sure.
Now, when we talk about the running back position, we saw 2 running backs go particularly high. Bijan, I think a lot of people expected Bijan to go high. Not so much for, I think, Jahmyr Gibbs, the running back with Georgia Tech. But I'm curious to pick your brain on this. I heard a lot of people over the last several months say that this draft class, at least at the top of the draft, was not as laden with blue chip prospects as previous years have been. Do you think that played a factor in why running backs like Bijan and Gibbs got picked a little bit higher than maybe some people thought they would be?
I really do, because I would say picks 1 to 25 weren't the normal first round. I think the meat of this draft was like 25 to 50. So that pushed the running backs up more. And that's why we saw them go. You saw Gibbs and Bijan go in the first round. I think that's exactly right. Because the draft wasn't as strong, those guys got pushed up for sure.
Yeah. So you mentioned how Bijan can be this sort of Christian McCaffrey type player for the Falcons, not only in the running game and the passing game, but particularly in the running game. They're going to need some help from the blockers up front, and the Falcons went in round 2 to get a blocker in Matthew Bergeron. And I saw, from the 33rd team that you guys did not have him rated as highly. Was one of listed among one of the top 9 reaches in this draft class simply because he was not in your top 100. And of course, the Falcons took him at the 38th overall. What were some of the issues that you saw in Bergeron's game that led to the 33rd team not necessarily rating him as highly as others did?
Aaron, I think he does have some talent, and he does have position flexibility, which is going to be a real big thing. He could play guard, he could play tackle, he could play both tackle spots, actually. What I saw were some inconsistencies in his footwork and with his hands. And at sometimes things surprised him a little bit, so his instincts weren't phenomenal. They were good, but he's not going to be ready right now. But I think next year at this time, with this kid's size and length and toughness, and he's very smart and high character, they could have a guy, and they could have a guy that could plug in as a guard or a tackle. So it could be a good thing for them.
I'm curious, what were your thoughts on the Falcons' 3rd and 4th round selections in Ohio State's Zach Harrison and Utah's Clark Phillips?
I really like Zach Harrison, what he could bring to the table perhaps a year or 2 from now, because I love his length and I love his effort. He could be a player that can play on the edge and also has the ability to play inside. So that could be a guy, and I love his effort too. So that could be a guy that we could hit on. And then Phillips is another guy, like, he's not the fastest guy, he's not the biggest guy, but he understands how to play. He's quick, he's low to the ground, he understands how to play the ball, he has really clean eyes, he understands route concepts. He could be a player, just have a little bit concerns about his top end play speed, Aaron.
Okay. Now, I'm curious, when you look at this draft overall, and how do you factor in the fact that the Falcons did not select the quarterback at the top of this year's draft and that they're rolling with Desmond Ridder? Does Desmond Ridder's performance this season kind of impact the perception of this Falcons draft class, or do you see those things as kind of independent of one another?
I think they picked the best players that were on the board. Will Levis was my number 1 quarterback, but I didn't feel like any of these quarterbacks were Andrew Luck or Trevor Lawrence, players like that. So I think the Falcons sat back and said, let's pick some good players. There's going to be more quarterbacks next year. Let's see how Ridder plays, and we'll go from there. I think that was their thought process for sure.
Okay. Do you think that's, I'm curious, a year ago when Desmond Ridder was coming out, what were your expectations for what he could be in the NFL?
I thought he had potential. I thought he had a natural arm strength. I thought he was a good athlete that could do some things with his feet. I want to see the kid play more. I want to see him in tough situations. I just want to see more of him. That's it. And I think if I were a Falcon fan, I'd want to make sure that he either was the guy or wasn't the guy, so we know moving forward.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, when it comes to the draft, and you already touched upon some of these players, like a player like Bijan Robinson, who can come in right away and impact, and some of these other players like Bergeron and Harrison that may be a little bit more of a developmental. As someone who, was a high-ranking executive with several teams, how do you sort of balance that with, trying to get players that can come in and contribute right away, as well as trying to balance it for the long-term future when teams are sort of assessing these prospects and stacking their board?
Well, as you're going through your meetings and you're stacking your board, you take all those things into account. The teams that I was on, we always wanted to take the best player, but that player needed to fill a need. So we would go outside a position. We would not draft a lesser player based on need within a grade range. So, for example, we would take a B- over a B+ based on need, but we would never take a B+ over an A- based on need because it's outside of grade range. And that's my experience with the teams that I was on, because at some point with injuries and attrition, you're going to need that player. And the more good players you pick, the better it is for your team.
Yeah, so that's where that whole best player available comes
Yes,
from, where you just want to get good players on your team and you kind of can figure it out from there. Is that fair?
exactly right. Right on.
All right. So I'm just curious, when you assess this Falcons draft class and sort of pit them in the NFC South, do you feel like this is a draft class that can help the Falcons win what is a wide open NFC South division?
Well, it all comes down to the quarterback. Which quarterback's going to play the best in the division will probably be the team that wins the division. But I think the Falcons got a great start because they with their first round pick, they picked a player that's going to be an immediate impact and score touchdowns and gain yards and move the chains for them. So they got an immediate impact player with their first pick, and I think that's going to translate into wins. So if I were a Falcons fan, I'd be pretty excited about this pick.
Absolutely. So, TJ, I really appreciate you joining me and sharing your insight into the Falcons and some of your insight into the whole process of drafting and developing an evaluation. Let the people know, what things you guys have going on over there at the 33rd team.
It's a really fun site, Aaron. I mean, we have during the football season, we go over all the games, we go in depth on the matchups, we get into fantasy, we get into gambling. We have former players, former coaches, former executives. It's a really fun site. Friends of mine that I tell them to go to the site, they can't get off. They're on for hour after hour. So if you're a football fan, go to the 33rd team. Lots of great content for sure.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you coming on, and I would love to get an opportunity in the future to pick your brain on future draft prospects, as well as your thoughts on the Atlanta Falcons as we get closer to the season.
Anytime, Aaron, I'd be glad to come back. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Absolutely. So, guys, that's wrapping up to our today's episode with TJ McCreight. Appreciate him for joining me on today's episode. We'll wrap up answering a listener question about the possibility of the Falcons trading back in this year's draft in round 1 and whether or not they could have gotten Bijan Robinson. So we'll break that down as we wrap up today's episode. But before we get there, I do want to give a shout out to all my everydayers that are out here subscribing on YouTube, subscribing on the various podcast platforms, giving those 5-star reviews, all of that and more. Really appreciate the everydayers that have stuck with me over these last couple of days as we've cranked out content pre and post draft, and we'll continue to crank out content here on Locked On Falcons post draft as we get into these individual breakdowns. And I have great guests like TJ McCreight to come on and share their thoughts on this Falcons draft class and what they're excited about seeing from this Falcons team this upcoming season. So, guys, let's wrap up today's episode talking about the trade back possibility. And this comes from a question from Blessings at UGA ATL Sports on Twitter. Yes, just watch your podcast about the draft. I'm curious what you thought of on not trading back before taking Bijan. I feel like we could have done the same deal the Lions did with the Cardinals, but add 110 that we ended up trading anyways. We could have picked up pick 34. Well, technically we couldn't have traded back doing the deal like the Lions did with the Cardinals because the Lions already did that deal before the Falcons were on the clock, right? So that trade was not a possibility. So the only teams that the Falcons realistically could have traded back with, in my opinion, would have been Philadelphia at 10 or Tennessee at pick 11. And who knows if Tennessee really wanted to trade up. They did ultimately trade up for Will Levis in round 2. And so the suspicion going into the draft was if that fourth quarterback is there at 8, could the Falcons move back and someone would want to come get him? It's possible that Tennessee would have done that, but the fact that they waited until round 2 tells me that, maybe they weren't as high on making that trade for Will Levis in round 1 in order to give up that draft capital to get him there. Because you would assume if they wanted to trade it for Will Levis, they would have just taken him at 11 rather than Peter Skoronski. So I don't feel like that trade would have materialized. And then your other trade partner is Philadelphia, and they wound up trading up to get Jalen Carter at 9. So it does seem a lot more plausible that Philadelphia was willing to come up, maybe one spot higher, either to get Jalen Carter or Bijan Robinson. And that's going to be the unknown that we have to speculate on. Philadelphia was the team that was most connected to Bijan Robinson early in the draft until the week of the draft when people started going like, maybe the Falcons could take him. But prior to that, everybody thought if Bijan's going to go early, it's going to be because Philly takes him at 10. I was always skeptical of that just because, Howie Roseman's draft philosophy. But if you're the Falcons in your war room, you don't really know, right? You suspect, like, I don't think Philly's if when Philly calls us, right, and say, hey, we want to come up, and you sit there in the war room and they're like, okay, who are they coming up for? Because they're not going to tell you, right? That's one of the things. Like, they're not telling you, like, we're coming up for this guy. Do you want to trade? That's not how it works. We're coming up. Do you want to trade? And so you have to kind of figure it out on your own. And so if you're in that Falcons war room, you're like, they're either coming up for Jalen Carter or they're coming up for Bijan. I think it's Jalen Carter, but it might be Bijan. And if you're the Falcons and you're not probably looking to draft Jalen Carter, right? Maybe your plan B is Peter Skoronski, but let's say you have like an A grade on I'm sorry, on Bijan Robinson and a B plus grade on Peter Skoronski, right? Or A plus grade to better illustrate the point. A plus on Bijan and a B plus on Peter Skoronski. Do you really want to give up the opportunity to get an A plus player in your draft? Even if you think it's only a 15% chance that Philly's coming up for Bijan Robinson, you don't know. And so do you want to risk it? And so I don't know if a trade is as likely to have materialized as some people will say. Like, again, that's a thing that, you'll hear fans say, well, oh, we could have traded back and gotten that player. And it's like, do you know that? Or are you just saying that because you did a mock draft simulation 14 times, and then the mock draft simulation, this player never got drafted at that point. But just because a mock draft simulator didn't have the player getting picked that high doesn't mean that that player wasn't going to get picked that high, right? These mock draft simulators are just basically guessing at how the draft is going to go. So if you're the Falcons, you're sitting there thinking, like, if we trade back, we risk losing out on Bijan Robinson. And then, I'm sure to many a fan, blessings you included, UGA ATL Sports, thinking, well, if we have to settle for Jalen Carter, that's not a bad thing. Well, I don't know if the Falcons would agree with that sentiment. So yeah, a trade back is possible, but given the circumstances, it's hard to know with confidence that trading back, you would still have been able to land Bijan Robinson at that pick. But I'm sure to many people, like, well, that ain't a problem to me because, positional value. Yes, I'm going to keep talking trash, guys, on positional value because, again, just weird. Like, again, it's fine. I get it. Like, in 3 years, we might be talking about, well, the positional value, what didn't work out for the Falcons or whatever. But, like, that is not a conversation I have any interest in having until 3 years from now. All right. So that's basically how I stand on that. So I hope that answers your question, UGATL Sports. But yeah, it doesn't seem like going into the draft, trading back was a very likely outcome or a likely scenario for the Falcons. But as the draft played out, it didn't seem like that was likely to happen. I'm sure they got offers, but I don't know if they got good offers, right? If Philly's like, oh, we'll give you a fifth. Like, okay, I'm like, we'll just take Bijan and just stay here. So who knows? But yeah, that's it, guys. Really appreciate it. You can do like blessings at UGATL Sports and send in your questions via Twitter at Locked On Falcons. You can hit me up on Facebook at Locked On Falcons. Send an email to lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel, or you can hit me up in the Locked On Falcons Discord, a link in the description below. Guys, continue to make us your first listen. Check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez to get your recaps on the NFL Draft. Of course, it's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.